Hello, welcome back to the show, Anatomy of Itihas, where we dissect history in a little bit different manner. So, Anshuman, what are we exactly discussing today?
So today we are going to discuss that how are states actually formed and what actually maintains the legitimacy of states in history. Basically, how do states impose their legitimacy upon people in history? And there are various ways, aristocracy or tax systems and provincial systems, which we will be talking about today.
Yeah, so you talked about the legitimacy of the state. I would like this to be a little bit broken down into further bit. Jesse, we alluded to our previous discussion about history of the subaltern and how that is left behind. When we talk about history, we talk only about the quote unquote elite and glorious parts of history. So let's break it down a little bit. I mean, what are exactly we are looking at? Because we are not looking at nation states per se. Anshuman?
Yes, so the idea with that we are not looking at nation states today, it's that we are actually looking at states or empires throughout history, and actually the main purpose of doing this was that we need to differentiate between the states we will be talking about today in history versus the nation state or the so-called states we have today. And by drawing this line of discussion, we need to compare history, because nowadays there is a thing that a lot of people talk about, that the concept of nationalism which we have today with nation states, the same concept existed, let's say 300 or 1600 or 1500 years ago, and it was a very prevalent thing. And instead, we can just take it that a lot of people argue that jingoism existed in history. However, if we actually look into history, it's not like that. Jingoism and nationalism, these are very recent constructs, and when we see and we actually study history to see that um, these concepts did not necessarily exist, but instead something existed which is not known to us right now. And it is something that which we can't imagine right now. For example, in history, we even see that provincial systems are existing. That, for example, if a particular king, this, if and a particular this is aristocrat. If the aristocrat is very, we can say, noble, and if the aristocrat is very loyal to him, the king would give him provinces instead, um, in return of his service. So that system does not exist right now. Now we have decentralized powers into state governments and district governments, and even to gram panchayat levels. But here it does not work like that. Here instead we have introduced the system of meritocracy instead. So these things are actually needed to be considered very efficiently when we talk that when we actually claim that there existed something like nationalism or jingoism in the past regarding the nation states as well. And some part of it actually very controversial goes back even to the famous rebellions like the rebellion of 1857, because how
Yeah.
we think it as one of the earliest nationalist movement, we need to actually deconstruct this, and we need to see that this concept of nationalism which we think about is very new actually in this context.
Yeah, but
So we will talk about
um,
this later too.
we'll talk about this later. But considering today's particular discussion, to understand regionalism or provincial attitude, you need to understand the difference. Like you alluded to the difference between how today there is decentralization at a confederate level. Let's say in different polities, depending upon where you are in the world. America में अलग है, India में it's a bit different, in Russia it's a bit different. But the way that decentralization, quote unquote, decentralization works in a medieval or a pre-modern setting is very different. To understand that, we'll have to understand the approach of the state, quote unquote state. Now, one of the most pervasive characteristics of the pre-modern state, as such, is the face value of the monarch. Because I mean, it is kind of, we are not discussing particularly oligarchs or other systems of pre-modern authority, although we'll try to integrate some form of that or the other when I'll discuss about the sharing of power between people. So the fundamental unit of authority, let's say, is the monarch in the pre-modern time, and states are defined through that. States are defined. The attitude of the state is defined through what kind of institution is really the monarch. And I say institution because there is this general trope of evolution that happens from fifth to even like the 18th, even under the British, that happens. So from the fifth century itself, the trope of the quote unquote institutionalization of the monarch is continuously happening. And you have different forms of like Daud Ali in his book, The Courtly Culture of India. He provides this example ki how different social religious trends, political trends, material trends even shape that idea and institution of monarch. To allude this, to give a certain sense of illustration to this, I'd like to travel a bit back in time, about 900 or 950 years back. So we reach a city in northern Karnataka called Maneketa. Any guesses which empire I'm talking about?
I already know because you had discussed it with me.
Okay, so you should inform the listeners.
I guess it was about the Rashtrakuta something. Right?
Ah, so we are talking about the Rashtrakutas. Now, I'll not go into the web cob of how exactly the Rashtrakuta Empire is formed in Deccan, because that's a very extensive period of, I'll have to discuss a lot of things. It's almost like a dominoes effect going berserk in Deccan. So basically, the Rashtrakutas are basically Kannada lords, feudal lords. They are transplanted into what is today called the Burhanpur Gap. There is this mountain range that connects northern India, passes next through the Vindhyas, passes through the Deccan and other parts of South India to North India. And this is done by their predecessor dynasty of the Chalukyas. Now, the Rashtrakutas as a polity are very interesting because they're doing a lot of stuff that is necessarily very new to the geography they are playing out it in. Because as we'll discuss in the ending part of this episode, how that has already happened in northern India, they are bringing certain trends of let's say kingship into Deccan that are unexplored. And they, for the first time, come up with this institution of the emperor. Why I would say the first time is that before that there is almost this loose kind of chain of aristocrats that are connected through a material or social culture that constitute a empire basically. But the Rashtrakutas do it a little bit different. But again, I'm sounding very complex right now. Let's break it down a further bit. Let's go to outside Maneketa and let's go to a peasant's village. And what is exactly he up to? Any like what can you try to paint a picture? What is exactly this peasant doing?
In what context are you asking that? What is the peasant doing? मतलब,
I mean, in any general context, like what, because we are talking about the state, what are really the experiences that you would equivalent of this peasant's life to interaction with the state, given that you know a little bit how exactly this might have been.
And the since he is peasant, so he's supposed to be an agricultural laborer. So his life would be very tough in that sense. Yes, and The state would also levy certain ranges of tax upon him.
Yeah, and with that also, there is little to, like, for example, in our modern lives, I come from like, we all come from a particular socioeconomic background, different levels of socioeconomic background. But the involvement of the state, or involvement of the empire, if I can use that term, uh, is very direct and is very apparent in our lives. Like, I own an Aadhaar card, you own government ID proofs, you own different things. The the peasant living in the Rashtrakuta empire is not exactly having any of that interaction with the royal court. Probably his world is till the Grama Sabha or the Panchayat, what we call Panchayat in northern India, uh, of his own village. I say this, and might sound very bizarre, but our popular conception of empires as these as basically modern states with these uniform flags, centers of power, capital cities, which is another stupendous claim that I would like to burst here. uh, these all don't exist, by the way. So the way a pre-modern or a medieval Indian empire is supposed to work is this: it's not what basically Sheldon Pollock calls not a it's not a quest for territorial ownership. It's rather a quest for subjugation. Now, the Rashtrakuta, why did I choose the Rashtrakutas to illustrate this example is very important, because I feel ki the Rashtrakutas are doing this in a very new, very bombastic kind of pattern. I mean, this has existed since centuries by this time, but the way the Rashtrakutas make it apparent is very different. And it starts with the title itself, which is not exclusively a Rashtrakuta title that is started by the Chalukyas. The title of the emperor is Shri Prithvi Vallabha, which basically the Sanskrit people who don't know Sanskrit or are not familiar with it. The translation of that goes is that he who is beloved of earth and Lakshmi, the goddess of wealth. So, in the conception of Rashtrakuta authority or power, socio-religious conception, of course, because it's the medieval time and religion and lives are not different. In the conception of the Rashtrakuta power, there is this idea that the emperor has, emperor owns the land. He is married to land, which is to say Prithvi, and he is chosen by fortune, Lakshmi, to be the beloved of her, basically representing the king as a allegory or personification of Vishnu, which happens other in other empires as well, if we look at it. But another part of this interesting thing is that, given that how the projection of the king's persona is made, another part of this is that how does the Rashtrakuta empire actually function on the ground level? So on the ground level, there are two three things that are constitute of the empire, what we generally in our conception call the empire, and that match with our modern conception, that there is a structure of the aristocracy that is there. And one of the more typical features of the Rashtrakutas, particularly, is that they are more militaristic chaps. They are very bombastic in military and military campaigns, and that correlates to how they see their state, or how they basically see the empire being formed. Because their conception of an empire is not necessarily owning land. Their conception of an empire necessarily is subjugating kings. This takes me to a very interesting part of a very interesting person. Would you like to guess who the person is?
Which part of history?
Rashtrakutas only, within the dynasty. Rashtrakutas only.
I'm guessing from the image it might be Govinda 3, maybe.
Yes, exactly. And why Govinda 3?
Govinda 3, if by the way, for the audience, if you don't know, Govinda 3 is a very talked about figure in Indian history because he is being famously called in Orissa as Raptabahu, if I'm not wrong, and famously being called for pillaging the Jagannath temple. And other than that, Govinda 3 is also mentioned to be a very aggressive, what we actually call as expansionist in that sense. And these are some talked about facts about Govinda 3 in history, and for these reasons only Govinda 3 happens to be one of the most talked about figures in the Rashtrakuta history. For example, if you even ask a layman in history, what do you know about Rashtrakutas? So he may or not be knowing a lot, but he must be knowing about Govinda 3. And we have included an image of his coin, which you can see in the center, where he's shown upon a horse. Gopal,
Yeah,
you can
shown
continue.
upon a horse leading his campaign in North India. So we go to understand the conception of Rashtrakuta power. We go to North Indian campaign of Govinda the Three, and after we are not going into the discussion of killing. That's for somewhere someday else, uh, possibly next week, if we are discussing that. So this guy basically defeats the Palas and the Pratiharas, the two major empires of North India, in what is typically called in Indian historical discourse the tripartite struggle. Although I don't agree to it, and there are multiple reasons behind it. Uh, but anyways, so he basically sets up this victory pillar of a or a or a flag, what what the Sanskrit texts refer as the Pali Dhwaja. Now, under this Pali Dhwaja, if you read the description of the Pali Dhwaja in the Sanjan plates of Amogha the son of Govinda the third, this Pali Dhwaja is supposed to be basically how many historians or many academicians have interpreted is a representation of the Rashtrakuta state itself. And if you look at the Pali Dhwaja, the central staff bears a Garuda or a Ganda Berunda, depending upon who you ask, which is the royal standard of the Rashtrakutas, Vaishnavite holy sign. And you see the same characteristics in Govinda's coin. It's a coin also, like the characteristics of a Shankha and a Chakra and lotus and other Vaishnavite symbols. Although the Rashtrakutas are not exclusively Vaishnav. So you see that, and there is again emanating from the central flag staff are other minor lords' flags. And I'm assuming that the Pratiharas and Palas, because at that point of the time they were defeated, their flags would have been at the very last of the rows. And everyone from their lowest of the lower vassals, vassal is a concept we'll be discussing right now. Vassal is basically a lower king in the hierarchy of kings. Every one of their vassals is looking at that central flag staff, this entire huge inflated military apparatus of the Rashtrakuta Empire is supposed to be seeing at that. Now, given that I've said that this is basically a representation of the Rashtrakuta state, how the Rashtrakuta state actually works is very interesting, and I'll explain. I talked about the peasant. This is why. I'll explain it through usually what people do is that they come from up the ladder to downwards. We'll go from the downwards itself. Now let's imagine Anshuman, you are a peasant in northern Karnataka. You're probably growing millet, or I don't think you are growing rice. You're probably growing millet or lentil, or other something else that is probably a lower variety of grain, because extensive agriculture has not yet reached the Deccan in that scale that every person is farming rice. Usually, the people who are farming rice are better off than people who are farming millet. So let's go to the very down of the ladder. So imagine, Anshuman, that you are this farmer and you wake up every day, you go to your field, probably you have a wife, probably kids who help out in the fields and etc. etc. The most central or the most intimate kind of authority that you have in your village is your Grama Sabha. And that Grama Sabha has a person or a chief called a Gramakuta. Very simple thing. Now, this Gramakuta either could be depending upon the social structure of the village. It could be hereditary or it could be elected. Elected in the sense that in pre-modern elections, only the people who had the means and property to vote could vote, and not even a vote. It was more like a, let's say, a agreement that this person is going to lead the village assembly for this time. And I said about different social backgrounds, because depending upon your social background, whether you are a farmer, whether you are a priest, basically a brahmin, whether you are of any other caste or class background, whether you are a shreni, whether you are part of a shreni, a sreshti, basically a businessman, a guild worker, depending upon the background of your caste or class, that basically constitutes the political structure of your nearest intimate place of power. Now we rise a level up to that. What happens is that you've got these 20 to 10 collections of villages, what is called the Trini Bhukti or the smaller Bhukti. And in these Bhuktis, there is a probably minor aristocrat who is, and these Bhuktis are relatively less urban, quote unquote, more in rural settings, probably smaller towns. And then there is a minor aristocrat governing these collections of villages called the Bhuktis. At the higher end, it is probably about 50 to 100 villages. At the lower end, it's about 20 to 10 to 20 villages. So as you move upward from the Bhukti, you go to the Vishaya, which is a province, which is a proper province. Now the Vishayas are governed by Vishayapatis, again mostly tended to be aristocratic men. And if you go from up a Vishaya, then you go to a Mahavishaya or a Rashtra, the place that the Rashtrakutas derived their imperial name, the Rashtrakutas, because they were basically transplanted into governing a Rashtra. So you go there and you have the Mahavishaya or the Rashtra governed by a Mahavishayapati or a Rashtrapati. Of course, the modern connotation of a Rashtrapati is very different, but this is where the word comes from. And on top of all these, let's say, quote unquote, secretariat is the Vallabha. But the aristocracy does not end there, interestingly, because all this is to be, I mean, there is no such distinction per se. When we are discussing military, we would I mean, I would very happily oblige to discuss how militarized actual Indian societies were, but anyways, that's a topic for a different day. But let's say these are quote unquote the civilian administration. The most immediate, Vallabha or the Sri Prithvi Vallabha, the Rashtrakuta emperor, would have had a circle of counselors and other various major aristocratic houses from his empire serving in different roles. So, for example, he would have a council of ministers or mantrins, or what the other texts called the Auparikas, tax collectors or other people of the secretariat. Then he would have someone called, the very important, by the way, Mahasandhi Vigrahaka, essentially a foreign minister. And then he would have a general, a military general, with grandiose titles like Mahaprachanda Dandanayaka or Dandanayaka. And all these have, like, they have their own subordinates. So Mahaprachanda Dandanayaka has a Nayaka, and then has a Nayaka has a Senapati, Senapati has a Samanta, and so on and so forth. So the size of, given the size of the empire, the apparatus of the aristocrats is quite inflated. Now, apart from that, there are other authorities affiliated to the Vallabha as well. The religious authority, for example, or let's say the other authorities include the Purapatis, or the basically the guardian of the fort, Kiladars, basically what in later medieval term becomes a Kiladar. But this is all very linear. I mean, you one would assume that, oh, the Vallabha orders something and then the apparatus basically passes it down. I would kind of disagree. I mean, given, I'll ask you a question, by the way. Given that what I've told you in the previous episode, what we have discussed about state capacity, do you think that the Rashtrakutas or any empire for that matter is able to execute orders very efficiently in this kind of aristocratic apparatus?
No, see, when we talk about how did the topmost institutions of the state of that time, by the way, not in state in present context, how did they disseminate their orders? This is actually very interesting to note. I will give some examples which are not from the Rashtrakutas but actually from the medieval empire. This is very interesting to note that when the topmost hierarchical level of the state disseminates some order in a period of history where you don't have internet to verify something, in a period of history where you don't have this constitutional force to you can say when you don't have this constitutional force to enable accessibility or to enable transparency, you will actually have to know that when a particular order is disseminated from the topmost monarchical level, it may or may not reach the bottommost people or basically the subaltern. A very good example from this, which a lot of people talk about, is about sati. So we know that there are two examples of sati, by the way. One I will choose from the very famous episode of William Bentinck, which is also talked by a lot of historians, and one of the historians whose take on this, Meenakshi Jain, if you know, she has received Padma Shri a few years ago, was one of her opinion was that, which was also very, I can say, rational. That, for example, in this particular period of time, if Raja Ram Mohan Roy has submitted a particular petition to the British government, and by that order of William Bentinck, sati has been abolished in India, it does not mean that from that very day sati stopped happening at all, because that is a age where internet does not exist, that is a age where transparency or accountability does not exist. So you can't expect 100% accuracy or the best to say 100% obedience of the particular order of the monarchy or from the topmost hierarchical level of the society. Another good example about this sati only is from how a lot of people talk that Akbar had actually very famously abolished sati. So this is a particular episode which is talked a lot about in history. But if you actually look upon how did the sati system actually worked in 16th century and the 17th century as well, you will actually see that the topmost aristocratic Rajputs were always exempted from the law of sati, because there were many reasons, because they formed a part of the aristocracy as well, and at the same time they have formed a part of the larger Hindu nobility group, which does not necessarily represent the whole of the so-called Hindu society at that time, because it is a very small part of the people of the particular religion, and at the same time they don't represent the whole religion as well. Like a lot of people today actually talk about that in Mughal aristocracy there were this particular number of Hindu noblemen, so you know there was Hindu representation and all. This claim is actually very ahistoric. Now you need to understand there is nothing like representation in 17th century. The emperor or the monarch chooses people he wants to according to his own jurisdiction. Now there is nothing like representation, so though they don't necessarily represent the whole subaltern class. And for this very reason also we see that throughout history many of the Rajput aristocrats were actually exempted from abiding by the law of abolishing sati. Firstly, because they had their own support in the Mughal Darbar as well. Secondly, because of their own legitimacy in their own respective provinces. Because, for example, let's say this at this particular point of time in history, a particular Rajput monarch is dead. He has some 20 or 29 concubines and two or three wives who would be committing sati. Who is going to object at the end of the day? If
And
any
more
commoner
importantly,
actually objects to it, Yes.
Yes, go on. You complete and then I'll come to it.
I was just saying that, for example, if a commoner even objects to it, uh, he can't stop it anyway. So we need to understand that this very pattern of democratic, in how democratic institutions work today, did not really exist in history.
Yeah, and that brings me to another fact that you talked about the Rajputs and Mughals, basically the vassal or overlord relationship in this context. I mean, the other thing that why the Mughals would not dare to do something like this is because they depend upon the Rajputs heavily, quite heavily, by the way. And
Exactly, for
this
this very reason.
this brings me to the part like we return to the Rashtrakutas right now. Like the Mughals depend upon the Rajputs, the Rashtrakutas depend upon their own vassals. And who are these vassals? Now, I talked about the Sandhi Vigrahakas, the Mahaprachanda Dandanayakas, and other very unscrupulous and terrifying titles of military. Most often, the and given what I've talked about the Rashtrakuta idea of subjugation of kings, I mean, the Rashtrakuta court would have just flourished with hundreds and hundreds of princelets from very minor, kings of, let's say, 100 to 150 villages to, lords of 4,000, 1,000 villages in the court of Manyaketa. And so the authority of the Vallabha depends upon all these people, and they are basically to quote Daud Ali, who is whose work courtly culture of pre medieval, yeah, early medieval India is a very recommended book of mine. So he basically says that the idea of kingship that has emerged post Guptas and basically during the Rashtrakutas is basically that these these royal families, are not necessarily when they are entering into a relationship of vassalage. It's not necessarily the classical European idea of, let's say, you are a vassal, therefore therefore you are lower than me, and I am your overlord, therefore I am higher than you. Of course, that kind of formal relationship exists, but it's more fluid in the sense that you don't have that kind of secretariat level apparata that we have today. Your IS officers and IPS officers giving exams, being selected. You can't do, if you are a Vallabha in 8th, 9th century, you can't necessarily do that in that particular time. So what you do instead is you share power with people. And another important, and because we are in a bit of time constraint, I'll jump to this very early, that along with sharing power with these individuals, the Rashtrakutas are also sharing power with ordinary citizens. Like, for example, I talked about the Grama Sabhas and I went into the specifications of the community. Like, if it's a Brahmin assembly of, let's say, 100, 200 villages controlling a very sacred site, let's say, what is today in Maharashtra, the Tulja Bhavani or the Pampa Devi Tirtham, or other major temples in and around Manekheta and the sacred centers of the empire, the Vallabha can't really do much about defying the wishes of that assembly. And what we get from inscriptions or otherwise the recommendations of political manuals from the time is that there is a great sense of autonomy. And I say autonomy that in a relative sense, in the relative condition of our imagination, there is this great sense of autonomy in these assemblies. That, of course, is subject to a heavy amount of privilege, given that you need to belong to that kind of class or a society or a guild that can actually, negotiate with the king. And that happens in other empires. That happens in, let's say, there is this very particular inscription that is there in Odisha that Ananga Bhima Deva basically issues, and he's granting land to a lot of other people. He's granting land to basically pot makers, perfume makers, the milkmaids, because they all control the temple administration. Right? I mean, he can do better than that. Same thing with the Cholas and the Aikutruvar or the 500 lords of Aivolu. That's about it. I mean, that this is how the medieval state actually functioned. People were not as much as connected to the emperor or the empire as we like to think they were. There was no national flag. There was only the flag of your overlord. Your maybe your gram had a flag depending upon the community. Maybe your shreni had a flag, and then of course there was the royal standard of the emperor.
That context, it is also that when you talk about how did this particular system of flags worked, in particular context of the movies we see today, which are actually supposed to be historical movies, we see that a particular flag is actually shown throughout the whole particular empire. For example, a very good example of this is the web series which was The Empire, which was about the first battle of Panipat and the uh, how power established the Mughal Empire in India. Or if you see certain movies like, let's say, mm, Chhawa or the Bajirao Mastani for a very good example, that you will see this particular saffron standard or the saffron flag is dominant throughout the movie. Same for the same for the web series which is The Empire. We see that there these days a lot of discussion has been around how has been the what has been actually the Mughal flag. There was nothing like Mughal flag, by the way. The official standard which you see, I will just display it here. Can you see the picture, Gopal?
Not yet. Matlab, doesn't come on my screen yet. Try to
Okay.
remove the existing wallpaper and then display.
Yes, yes. Uh,
Of course, the idea
so
that a Mughal flag exists is quite,
yes,
it's stupid. Yeah, yeah, I
yes,
can see that.
because there has been. So this is a very idealized image of the what we very colloquially call today the Sheri Khurshid, which is the lion and the sun. Which in many web series and many movies you will see it is shown as the official flag of the Mughal Empire. There was nothing like the official flag of the Mughal Empire. If you see, even in wars, there were different levels of flags and standards which the empire had. Uh, Different level. For example, there's one more image which I'm showing right now. Yes. Yes. So can you see the image, Gopal?
Yeah, 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 I
Yes.
can see that.
So
And it resembles a Maratha
can you?
flag.
Yes. And can you guess that from which part of history it is? Of Mughal history, if you know.
I'm
Because this is a
assuming
very
this
famous painting.
is. Yeah, I recognize this. I am assuming this is from Padshanama of Shah Jahan.
Yes,
I'm
from
assuming
that
it.
time period only. Yes. Yes. So this particular image actually is a painting of the very famous siege of Kandahar, of how Kandahar was actually conquered by the Mughals during Shah Jahan, because Kandahar was a very, we can say, we still call it the grave of empires, and it was one of the provinces which even before that Jahangir and
Yeah,
the son
basically
of which
whatever the Pratiharas, Palas, and Rashtrakutas are doing in for Kannauj, The Uzbek
with
Safavids
Kannauj
are Mughals are do- yeah. The Uzbek Safavids are
doing
and
for
Mughals are doing for Kandahar.
Kandahar. And if you see this, so at the end, finally, during the time of Shah Jahan, Kandahar officially enters into the Mughal domain, and this is a painting. Now, I would actually show you the whole painting, by the way, because uh, yes, this is the whole painting. So there has been this article in Scroll which I had read quite a while ago, and this article actually beautifully explains the whole picture, whole painting, and this whole painting I had actually specifically reserved for this discussion only because it actually shows that how does a state actually work in medieval India, and it is very different from how does the state actually work today. So starting from, can you see the zoomed version of it?
Yeah, I can see that. I can see that. You can continue.
Okay. So this particular image, we know that it is about the siege of Kandahar and particularly very bombastic seas in what you had said about the Rashtrakutas. The first thing first, which I had why I had picked this was to show that how there is never a uniform flag in history. Now, if you see this standard and this standard, both are completely different in colors. Now, the Shere Khurshid might be there, but even in many flags, the Shere Khurshid is not there. The sun and the lion. So, why does this occur is actually because there was nothing like a unified flag in these particular pre-medieval or medieval empires. Instead, every section of the army had its own flag staff or had its own, we can say, symbolic measure like these flags or symbolic measure like the head of the particular segment of the army. And because we know that there was a very famous technique which we call the Rumi technique, which was brought by Babur, which by which he famously won the first battle of Panipat. That it was like the whole army was divided into several battalions and groups, and apart from that, these all battalions and groups were supposed to attack the enemy very um, not all by once, but in a series, like a sequential event, one after other from
What
different parts of
basically,
the
what
battlefield.
basically, yeah, what basically is the classical, like what is a cross between the Nerge, which is the Mongol way of doing war, and the Rum
Yes,
Dastur, which is the Ottoman way of doing war.
yes, and it was actually bought from Turkey. Now, this is the whole image. Now, if you actually see today, whenever we talk about wars between nation states, we the sense of nationalism is also very prevalent. That, for example, if my country is particularly going against a war of your country because of so and so events in the past, I am supposed to be very jingoistic and I need to defend my country, and that is the prevalent notion we have today about nationalism. Now, in this whole picture itself, you will see that this notion is actually defied. And who defies it? The artist itself. So, in the bottom, you will see a pair of rabbits. Can you see this?
Yeah, yeah, snubbing on grass.
Yes. So, these two pair of rabbits now, first thing first, do you even think it is next to impossible that there's a whole war going on and upper you will see a fort is being blasted, and it is
Yeah, rabbits
not
are
even
the
possible
least
that two
likely.
animals.
Rabbits
Yes,
are the least likely
the
creatures
rabbits.
to exist there. Yeah, go on.
And if you see here, so In the bottom image, you will see that these two rabbits are snubbing onto grass, and these rabbits are being added deliberately by the artist. This was actually to give a contrast to what was मतलब ऊपर क्या हो रहा है and what the artist wants to show here, because he wants to give a contrast between the how the so-called masculine and bombastic nature of conquest are, and compared to how the lives of the common people are affected by it. Like most of the in most of the cases, the lives of the common people are affected on a negative way only. You will see you will see certain skeletons and corpses lying on the upper scene, on the upper scene of the painting, but at the bottom scene, on a deeper level, the lives of the commoners are not very much affected, and that is why the rabbits are being shown, because rabbits are not affected by the whole scene, who what all is going on there. And this particular image is actually interpreted by a lot of art historians in different ways, which all of them point towards this particular notion, that how states worked in medieval India, they were such that they may or may not necessarily impact the common lives of the people. Like there would be violence and there would be a lot of massacres and a lot of people dying in wars and even in organized massacres against the king or against the state. But on a deeper level, there was no such what we today call the so-called development in their lives. And that is being showed by this whole painting. And this was the whole gist of this painting, which actually explains that how do nation states which exist today, they don't work like what existed, let's say, 500 or 300 years ago. So I will just stop sharing. Hmm.
Yeah. So, given the context of what you discussed last time, in the last segment, ki how flags are not there and there is no proper centralization or standardization of the state, which brings me to ki, and also the fact ki in these wars or transactions between the state, the common folk are really suffering, which also brings me to the fact that the state does not, like, given the relationship of the state in the Rashtrakuta Empire, or how you discussed about the Mughals, it's not really that the state really cares for the prosperity of the people. The primary objective of the pre-modern state to some extent is protection. And this is going to feature a lot in the next episode that we do about military. The primary objective of a state as such is protection in pre-modern times. And given the fact that how limited the state approach or the capacity of the state is in these pre-modern times, there is this continuous negotiation that is happening between the quote unquote citizens and the empire. Now there is nothing like a citizenship in the Rashtrakuta Empire. You are all subjects to the king, the Vallabha, or the emperor, or whoever is your authority in pre-modern times. So the state essentially in India, there are two major distinctions and two major similarities in this. In other words, the major similarities are the state in 9th century Europe and 9th century India are aristocratic or monarchic in order. They're not necessarily the best places to be, as we have discussed in the first episode. The second thing is that they all operate on this understanding, this tacit understanding of symbols. Now, you talked about the flags. In the Rashtrakuta Empire, for example, if a warrior is being promoted, or let's say a feudal lord is being promoted, the way that he or she, there is no she in most cases, but the way he basically um, distinguishes himself from the rest of the people of the empire is that he is given something called the Panchamahashabdas, which is to say that the shankha, the symbol, the conch, then the trumpet, then the cymbals, then parasol. Now, parasols are important because parasols are basically signs of authority, or signs of your signs of paramountcy or sovereignty in that sense. So, depending upon the color of the umbrella, your rank in the aristocracy and the capabilities, the amount of power and amount of resources you could hold was significant. And all these, if you read like into the lines, all the materials in the empire itself or the court itself are signifying all these things. So these are the two major similarities between Europe or other parts of the aristocracy or the state in this period of time and India. The distinction between both of them is that there is necessarily by the 15th and 14th 15th century in Europe there is this great